My name is Shyla Raghav, and I lead the climate change program at Conservation International. And I'm deeply honored to be here with our distinguished panel today to talk about an issue that has not received the attention or awareness it deserves. One of the things that I've learned throughout my career is that climate change does not respect borders. The impacts of climate change, which range from human migration of populations across borders to shifts in the access and availability of natural resources like freshwater, do not respect the artificial boundaries that we've created around places. I myself have my origins in India. My mother comes from the foothills of the Himalayas. And so I have instilled within me this deep deference and respect for the spiritual and ecological importance of the river systems of India. And I know that that deference and respect is not exclusive to India. And so I'm thrilled to have our three panelists here that are joining me for a very important conversation about the third pole, which essentially signifies the vast glacier network of the Himalayan region. To talk about what their experience, the depth of their experience has taught them, about the critical importance of the third pole, about how in particular, climate change is going to affect the resources, the availability of water, how there might be extremes in climate change there might be an excess of water in the short term, leading to an increase in glacial lake outburst floods, or far into the future might actually imply a decline in water supply, to share with us their expertise and experience and see how we can work together to build the solutions for a more resilient future. And so I will be inviting each of our panelists to provide about 5 minutes of remarks. I then have some questions that I will ask them, and we'll leave the balance of the time for all of you to ask our panelists your own questions. So to my right is Ólafur Grímsson, who is the former president of Iceland. I was first exposed and introduced to the issue of the whole concept of the third pole by President Grímsson. He's really been the driving force behind the Arctic Circle, and also has probably the best definition and description of the third pole I've heard to date. To my left is Arjun Divecha, who's the director of the Divecha Climate Change Centre, which is in India. And so I'm very keen to hear from him about his vision for this center and its critical importance of studying the glaciers of India and of the Himalayan region. And then furthest to my left is David Breashears, who is a filmmaker, explorer, author, and the founding member of GlacierWorks, who has vastly documented how climate change is affecting the Himalayan region. And so I'm very curious to learn from him about what he's observed firsthand and how his experience on communicating the issues relative to climate change in the Himalayan region over his tenure and his career. So we'll start with President Grímsson, if you wouldn't mind sharing with the audience for 5 minutes your take on the third pole, your commitment to elevating the importance of the third pole as an important geopolitical issue.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to talk about the third pole in these extraordinary settings with these dramatic pictures and footage that speaks clearer and with more eloquence than I think any of us can do in words. I come from a world, Iceland and the Arctic, where the ice is melting very fast, where the gradual disappearance of the Arctic sea ice is causing extreme weather patterns in Asia a few months later, and where the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, which next to Antarctica is the largest ice sheet in the world, is creating new rivers and lakes. And if only 20% of the Greenland ice sheet melts, it will lead to a global rise in sea level about 2 meters. And we are all familiar with the North Pole and the South Pole, with the Arctic and Antarctica. But as incredible as it is, the focus on the glaciers in the Himalayas has been largely missing, and I emphasize that again, has been largely missing from the international climate debate. And it's kind of unfortunate because, as most of you know, the Himalayan glaciers are the water towers of Asia. All the major rivers of China and India have their origin there. And there are 3 nuclear weapon states that have borders in the Himalayan regions. And as has been pointed out by these photographs, they are disappearing at an extraordinary pace. I became first aware of this connection over a decade ago through my cooperation with India and China. And since then, I have used the Arctic model, which paradoxically Russia and the United States have cooperated quite successfully despite the conflicts in other parts of the world now for over 20 years. But when you look at the third pole Himalayan region, India, China, Nepal, Bhutan, Pakistan, Bangladesh are not really cooperating at all. As I say to my Chinese and Indian friends, that since China and India were 5 years ago accepted as observer states in the Arctic Council, they have a formal seat at the table on the ice in my part of the world, but they are not talking or cooperating on the ice and the glaciers in their part of the world. The difference between Antarctica on one hand and the Arctic and the Himalayas on the other is that the Arctic and the Himalayas are the only 2 major ice-covered areas in the world where states and people are there coexisting with the ice. And the impact of the melting glaciers is already being felt by communities and people and nations and countries on a dramatic scale. So what I have been doing in the last 5 or 6 years is to bring the model of the successful Arctic cooperation illustrated by the annual Arctic Circle Assembly, which I founded. It takes place in Iceland every October, where over 2,000 people from more than 60 countries come together, a gradual dialogue on the cooperation of the Arctic, including delegations from India, China, Korea, Japan, and Singapore. But there is nothing similar on the Himalayan third pole region. But the fact of the matter is that probably the largest global disaster that will be caused by climate change will occur in the third pole Himalaya region through its impact on the rivers, the food production, and the livelihood, as well as the potential water conflicts between India, China, and Pakistan. So I believe that it's absolutely crucial for the success of the global climate debate to bring the third pole into a key focus and awareness, because there you see the effects in a dramatic way. By the way, the third pole is a brilliant concept. We in the West used to talk about the Himalayas, and that was the term I used in the beginning of my endeavors in this area. But it was pointed out to me by Jan Todong, the head of the Chinese Tibetan Plateau Institute, that the third pole had a much stronger meaning in this international debate. We have the North Pole, we have the South Pole, and we have the third pole. And therefore, it has become a kind of a mission for me and my partners to try to bring China and India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, and the others together systematically on a cooperation on the region. And why should I do it from Iceland? Because I have no stake in the region. I have no military interest, I have no economic interest, I have no political interest. And the tension between these countries is so sensitive that it needs somebody from the outside to bring them to the table. The lack of research on these glaciers is also alarming. Jan Todong has told me that at the present rate of climate change, by the middle of this century, 70% of them will have disappeared. Think about it. 70% of them will have disappeared in 30 years' time. And the consequences for up to 2 billion people on the planet will be much more monumental than the hurricanes in America or Florida or anywhere else that get this coverage on American television when they happen. So thank you for inviting me to this dialogue, because I have formed a kind of political conclusion that in this conflict-ridden, ignorance-rich debate about climate change, by concentrating on the ice, we can get through. Because the ice is neither a Democrat or a Republican. It's simply melting. And it speaks loudly. And it tells us an alarming story. And that's why the third pole should be at the very center of the global climate movement.
Thank you, President Grímsson. So one of the key issues you flagged was the lack of understanding and research. Arjun, would you mind sharing your experience setting up a climate change research center in India?
Sure. A colleague of mine, who some of you are probably familiar with, Jeremy Grantham, basically jointly set up the center at what we consider to be the premier research, scientific research institution in India, which is the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. And so basically, it's a center that focuses on climate change, and it cooperates very closely with the Grantham Institute for Global Warming, which is based in the London School of Economics and also at Imperial College in London. So it's kind of a very close cooperation with other centers on climate change. And the basic thinking was that there's no point doing research only in the West if you don't get India and China on board. And so that was really kind of the impetus for setting it up. Now, within the center, obviously, we focus on multiple topics having to do with monsoons, having to do with black carbon, which is, again, a pretty big issue for the glaciers, and I'll get back to that in a second. But having to do with all kinds of issues with the climate in India specifically. And I'd like to relate a little bit of a story of one of the professors there, Dr. Anil Kulkarni, who has been, he's really a fascinating person, because he has, for the last 30 years or so, been traveling every single year to the Himalayas and basically documenting what's been going on. And so he has his own photographs and things of what's been going on in the glaciers. And he's really one of the most eminent glaciologists in the world. And the last time that I was visiting, he told me this story, which is quite interesting. He was telling me about the glacial lakes, which you heard a little bit earlier from Dick Bloom, that this is really becoming a really big problem. When the glaciers melt, essentially they tend to form lakes. And the real problem with the lakes is that there's an ice plug at the end of it. And what will eventually happen is the ice plug will melt and all this water will flow out. Now, what has changed recently is basically that some of the remote sensing technology now allows them to basically estimate the depth of the lakes. And so since you know the shape of the lake and you know the depth of the lake at various points, you can now estimate how much water there is actually in a lake. And so he related the story of how they had done this for this one lake, the South Lonak Glacier lake in Sikkim, which is one of the Indian states. And he published a paper basically showing what is the volume of water 5 years ago and then what is the volume of water now, and basically what would be the consequences of this ice plug breaking, because there are pretty large population centers downstream of there. And he said what is remarkable was that within a week of his publishing this paper, he got a call from the governor of the state of Sikkim, basically saying, wow, we never knew about this, what can we do about it? And they effectively hired the center to do kind of a mitigation study on what can we do to actually deal with this. And interestingly enough, the government of India, the center, allocated money immediately to kind of do research and try to figure out. And what the center came up with was an extremely simple solution, which is let's siphon the water out. And so we got this set of tubes, which is basically which is put in the middle of the lake, and it basically goes out and siphons the water out. And so for the last 3 years, that's what they've been doing. They've been siphoning the water out. But the point basically is that what Dr. Kulkarni's research shows is that he's identified at least 50 of these glacial lakes. He said that basically, fortunately, most of them are not near population centers, and so they're not a risk to the population center, but they are a huge problem, as Shyla basically mentioned, because eventually they will, if all of these things melt, you will now suddenly have a lot of water during the monsoon and no water during the rest of the year. So that's an interesting kind of thing that we feel like we've been working on.
Thank you for sharing. David, can you share with us what you've seen? What have you been able to document? What have you learned from the work that you've done to capture and communicate more broadly what's happening in the region?
Yes, but first I'd like to start by thanking Richard Blum for his very nice introduction. I also want to point out that he made a very generous contribution to this exhibition, and has done tremendous work in the region through his American Himalayan Foundation. But also, the first time I went to Mount Everest was with Richard Blum and the Kangshung Face in 1981. So we go way back. I'd like to start by defining this area we're talking about, the third pole, which as scientists that I work with and groups I work with, we call it HMA, High Mountain Asia, since it's not actually what we typically call a pole. I've been to almost every part of this vast collection of mountain ranges. So it starts in the northwest China in the Tian Shan range, which borders what's now Kazakhstan. You move south from the Tian Shan, and then you're in the Pamir in Tajikistan. If you move southwest a little bit, you're in the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan. If you move west, east from the Hindu Kush, you're in the vast, mighty Karakoram, where many of the world's highest peaks lie, and the longest glaciers in this region lie, and K2, the world's second highest mountain, rises there. If you move down the range, you get to the Chitral, and then you move into India and what we know is typically the Himalaya. And we have India, and we move east. The range runs through Nepal, and then it runs through Sikkim, and then it runs through Bhutan, and a little bit further east through Arunachal Pradesh to what's considered the eastern end of the range at Namcha. So that's what I refer to as high mountain Asia. And there are roughly 16 to 30,000 glaciers there, depending on which scientist you talk to. And I've been to all of those ranges except the Hindu Kush. Dick has been in Nepal for 50 years. I've been 38 years. I went when I was 23 as a mountaineer and a filmmaker. And over time, I've been on over 60 expeditions to the region and really didn't know what was happening underfoot. And we really weren't that aware in the early 80s and late 70s about what impact climate change would come to have on the glaciers. But one thing important to know about the image you're seeing, which is, for me, I'm starting a record, the second data point. We've had 18 expeditions alone for GlacierWorks, ranging from, we're spending our time at 18,000 feet, 20,000 feet, 21,000 feet, because these are hard to access areas. And it takes sometimes tremendous mountaineering skills and expertise to get there, which is why, as Ólafur said, they're little studied. And there's only so much resolution you can get from remote sensing, and it's not granular enough for some scientists, nor do you get, what's very important to me, is the view from the person standing on the glacier. And if you have the time after this exhibition or after this event and to come back, you'll see the change firsthand. And so this work I've done from Pakistan and K2 all the way to Arunachal Pradesh over the last 10 years is simply to bring back a record of the change and to continue documenting that change with extremely high resolution imagery. Some of our images have over 3.4 billion pixels, because one panoramic image is composed of 477 images. Scientists across the globe who are interested in this region now have very, very clear records at an oblique angle of what's happening to the glaciers. Now, what I've seen is this. I've seen complete and utter destruction of many of the glaciers. Glaciers that I first walked across in 1979, and now I'm again walking across without having passed them again in an interval until 2018, I don't recognize anymore. They're shrinking, they're retreating, they're ablating, but basically they're not in good health. One important thing, though, I'd like to point out is there's tremendous nuance here. There are the central and eastern Himalayan glaciers are under more pressure from certain climate forcing factors, and they get their water in the monsoon, their snow. And it's often falling now higher and higher as rain. The glaciers, some glaciers in the Karakoram and some glaciers in the Tian Shan have a positive mass balance ratio or negative, meaning they're stable because they get their snowfall in the winter, and that snowfall turns into ice and actually are keeping some of these glaciers stable. So what I've learned from my work with many, many scientists, from JPL to NASA to MIT to any group that wants to work with me and look at the imagery, is that it's very complex and it's very subtle. And from my part, I can only tell you what I've seen, which is the destruction of the glaciers, but there are 10 or 15,000 glaciers I have not set foot on. And people do need to set foot on them, as Ólafur said, and get out there and into the field. But it's hard, dangerous work, and it's problems with altitude sickness and other things. But we need to get them out there to bring back stories, because if you don't see what's happening, you don't know what to care about. And if you don't care about something, we can't give you a narrative. So the images that I bring back basically are meant to start a conversation.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Thank you. So what I'm curious to understand is kind of this translation of your understanding and what you've documented into action. So Arjun, you spoke about how the research from your center actually informed a response at the governor level. What are some of those examples? Are you actually seeing what you've experienced, what you know, the forums that you've brought together at the Arctic Circle translate into actions and any tangible responses, or is there still not the requisite level of understanding?
Well, I can give you an example of, quite frankly, when we set up the center, I think that while we're interested in the research work, obviously, I think the real goal is basically to affect policy, because at the end of the day, if you can't affect policy, none of it really matters. And so, if you recall, prior to the Paris Accord, India was very skeptical about basically doing anything. And the good news from our point of view is that 3 months before the Paris Accord, Prime Minister Modi called the director of our center to basically spend a day with him talking about, what do we know about climate change. And so we think that we helped influence, his decision in basically making a 180-degree shift in India's view on climate change. And, now, as you're probably aware, India has really become, quite big on solar and, is really building a lot of stuff. So we like to think that we help to, hope to shape policy, because that's really what matters.
Yeah.
But I think it is important to recognize, with all due respect to the research that Anit Karni and a few others have done, that whereas there has been an enormous amount of financial resources and scientific manpower put into research in Antarctica, And we have many nations, Korea, Japan, United States, United Kingdom, and others, Russia, with permanent research stations there. There's been extraordinary research also taking place in the Arctic. But the amount of research that has been done on the Himalayan glaciers is tiny compared to that. Bhutan, Nepal, I think I'm right in saying have no glaciologists. 10 years ago, I was told by knowledgeable people in India that although there were 10,000 glaciers at least on the Indian side of the Himalayas, there were less than 10 glaciologists in India. That was less than 1 per 1,000 glaciers on the Indian side of the Himalayas. Ya Dong, who leads the Tibetan Plateau Research Institute in China on the Third Pole, was trained 25 years ago here in the United States. So our level of knowledge on what's happening to the glaciers on the Third Pole is alarmingly lacking in terms of the scope and the effect on the pace of the melting that is taking place. David mentioned that there were at least 10,000 glaciers and so on that there's hardly any knowledge about. But it's very important to realize that the countries in the region, each of them, perhaps apart from China, which I think is the only one which has a systematic high-level institute. I've tried to get India to establish a formal glaciological institute without success. And when we organized 6 years ago in Dehradun, what was the first conference in India on the cooperation in the Himalayan region, and even if the then Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, agreed with me to organize it and supported it, and the Minister of Science from India was going to address the opening session together with me, when 11 Chinese glaciologists were going to come to the conference, the Indian Minister of the Interior refused visa to 8 of them. So we had to raise hell in the Indian bureaucracy the day before the conference was going to start, and even to allow them to come in. And to the best of my knowledge, the lack of cooperation between these countries in the Third Pole region has not improved very much. As I said before, they are more active on the ice in my part of the world than they are in their part of the world. So I think one of the challenges that we have as a climate movement, and we need to really focus on that, is how politically, diplomatically, in policy terms, and in science terms, can we support through foundations in the Western world, through active engagement by various scientists from the Western world, and also public organizations like Conservation International and others, bring those countries together. And that is why I believe what we have started with this Third Pole Himalayan process, which is linked to the Arctic Circle gatherings every year in Iceland, is a very important way to get India, Pakistan, China, Nepal, Bhutan, and the others, plus Afghanistan, and to the table, and to train young scientists. Because the lack of young scientists who can point out what you described about the glacial lakes is alarmingly lacking. So I say to all of you who are actively concerned about the relevance of the climate change movement globally, we need to bring much more effort into scaling up the scientific research and the active cooperation on the Third Pole. And that's why I welcome this evening here tonight, because it's a signal that at the climate summit in San Francisco, people for the first time are beginning to realize that the Third Pole has to be an integral, fundamental part of our global movement.
Thank you. David, can you comment on that? Does that line up with what you've experienced, the variations that you've seen across the different countries that you've been in the region?
Well, I've worked very closely with the organization you're familiar with, ICIMOD, which is the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, who are doing a very good job at exactly what you're proposing. And you're very familiar with that organization. and they work with all the Himalayan in this transboundary region, all the countries in this region, specifically on the issue of glaciers and deforestation. And I've attended many big conferences with Indian geologists, glaciologists, Pakistani glaciologists, Chinese glaciologists, and Nepalese glaciologists. By the way, I have been into the field with very talented Nepalese glaciologists. They are there, and they're very talented, and they're very committed. One thing they lack is the mountaineering skills. But one thing we walk away from out of these meetings is that many of these countries are incredibly antagonistic towards one another. And these are sensitive border regions. Pakistan and India have fought, lobbing shells into the Siachen Glacier, the world's highest war for how long, Arjun?
For 50 years.
50 years. They've been sitting up there and dying at 20,000 feet, posted all through the winter. You have the tensions between China and India, who India on all of their maps still claim all of Arunachal Pradesh as part of their country, correct?
Yep.
And we see all the time these conflicts happening in these high mountain regions at borders and passes. And so there's issues of territory, but also water is, along with air and food, something we absolutely cannot live without. We can drill more oil, we can mine more coal. You can't make more water unless you're in the desert, Saudi Arabia, and you're making it from seawater. So the idea is exactly what's being discussed here, is this lack of cooperation. These are sensitive border informations, and they do not like to share information about hydrology. And that's what a glacier is. It's just frozen water, not liquid water, and it's the headwaters for many of the great rivers in Asia. Because once people run out of water, that means they run out of food for their crops, they're going to move. And there might be transnational or international, within the country migration, and that's going to lead to one thing. And these high mountain areas are densely populated, and there will be conflict. And I think that's what you're talking about. You know, this is when things are going to get very serious, when people do not have access to water to drink or for water for their crops.
Yeah, actually, on that subject, the situation is actually going to get much worse relatively soon, because the Chinese are building some fairly big dams up near the headwaters of some of the rivers, which then cross over into India. And so India is now kind of objecting to the Chinese building these dams. And this is really, and there's clearly no solution to this problem. And this is going to cause more problems between China and India.
But this thing about funding is so spot on because the talent is there. There's a whole new generation in Nepal, very extremely talented in all areas of science and technology, yearning to go out and do something. Like you said, there is, except for ICIMOD, which is an internationally funded organization, there is no place to get good training as a glaciologist. But to train them not only to be glaciologists, but they're going to need to be trained to be mountaineers.
Yeah, sure.
And that's what's keeping a lot of them out of the mountains. When we try to bring them with us, the terrain is too difficult and they have no experience with altitude. So along with the training of scientists, we need to train mountaineers. Because if you look at those pictures there, well, there's the Himalayas, and you don't get up to those glaciers in a pair of sandals.
So my last question for you all before we open it up to the audience for questions is, if you could pick one thing that you would invest in, is it more government attention? Is it policy? Is it philanthropic dollars going into university research programs? Is it a UN resolution? Is it a regional body, a formal regional body? What is the one thing that you think could have the biggest difference or have the biggest impact on solving some of these issues?
What Ólafur has been talking about. Find a way to get the countries to cooperate. But that's top down, and that's going to take a long time. Invest in youth. You know, find an 18-year-old who wants to be a glaciologist. In 6 years, they have a PhD. And train them to go out and form centers and communities where these people support each other. And throughout all of the Himalaya, there are talented climbers in the mountains. Make the Sherpas a part of it. I don't know. Make the Balti porters part of it. But I think this training and getting them out into the field, because this range is just too vast. It's going to need a lot of people to study it.
Well, I mean, the small thing that we're doing is basically we started this center about 7 years ago, and we already now have, I believe at last count, 18 PhD students who are basically working on climate change. And so it's kind of the first PhD program in India, I think, which is actually awarding degrees in climate change. So it's a small thing, but that's where we're heading.
Thank you.
Well, I think there are three things we need to do. One you mentioned is to train the scientists, and I think that can be done actually in a shorter time than you indicated. And we have some experience of that. When I was awarded the Nehru Prize some years ago, I gave the money to the cause of training young Indian scientists in glaciologists. And there was enormous interest in people who already had a master's degree or PhD in relevant areas. And we have brought them to Iceland, and we have trained them, and we have seen the training that now takes place at the Tibetan Plateau Institute and others. So by concentrated effort, I believe we could, in a reasonably short time, get an enhanced level of scientific capability in the area. The second thing, which has not been mentioned here, is to bring the indigenous people who live up in the Himalayan regions to bear witness to what's happening, and to have the funding and the possibility to both let them bear witness within their respective countries and also internationally. And we have some processes of trying to bring the indigenous people. It's not easy politically, but I think it can be done, because they are feeling the disappearance of the water resources. They are feeling the actual threat. And when I visited the Yukon area in China a few years ago, it was very impressive to see the local people in front of officials from Beijing bearing witness what was happening to the glaciers and the melting. But the third level is we have to work on the governmental authorities in all these countries. And just a few weeks ago, we got an agreement from China to host in Beijing next May a conference for the first time of that level in China on the third pole cooperation and how to use the Arctic model of cooperation, where the United States and Russia and Canada and the other Arctic states work together as an inspiration for the Himalayan countries. And to me, that is an important landmark that we have not now got at the highest level in China, a formal recognition that they need, in cooperation with us from the outside, to send signals to their neighboring countries that this is a common concern to all the countries in the Himalayas. But I say again, as I said before, I believe in terms of public influence in the climate debate, it can work wonders for our cause in America, in Europe, and elsewhere, to bring more knowledge to what's happening in the third pole Himalayan region to the public and the political community in the Western world.
Thank you. So now we have about 15 minutes left. So this is your opportunity to ask our panelists any questions. I believe we have some microphones. Yes. Right here in the front.
Hi, thank you. I have two brief questions. I'm curious, how does the quantity of ice in the glaciers in the third pole compare to, say, the quantity of ice in the Greenland ice shelf? And secondly, it seems to me the implications of glacial melting in the Himalayas would lead to catastrophic flooding followed by catastrophic drought and agricultural devastation. Is that a proper way to think of it, potentially?
There's a lot more mass of ice in Greenland. That's a massive sometimes 10,000 foot thick ice pack. Some of the glaciers we walk on in the Himalaya are 300 feet deep, and they're long, but they're shallow glaciers. Do you want to answer any other part of that? What was this next part of your question?
Floods and droughts.
Well, the glaciers are not. Some of the glaciers are sublimating, which was in a solid turns into a gas and goes up into the atmosphere. You don't see. They're not melting at a rate that water just starts gushing out of a glacier. Sometimes what you see coming, I've been to the headwaters of the Tsangpo, the Brahmaputra. I've been to Kailash and the headwaters of the Indus. I've been to the headwaters of the Gangotri, of the Ganga and the Gangotri. And sometimes these glaciers are putting out small streams. It's a collection of glaciers that move together. The tributaries grow together, and we have a river. But the bigger problem is when the glaciers are gone. Okay, flooding could come from this. One of the points of a glacier is it holds moisture. It collects snow that turns into ice. And the glaciers that we're seeing now are no longer capable of holding snow because the snow is falling onto warm dirt and boulders because the ice is gone. And so that water, which is now, it's in its liquid form, rain falling on glaciers that no longer exist, that moisture is no longer stored as snow in the summer. And then it can run off during the monsoon when they're already having very big floods. The other thing that happens is that ice is supposed to be stored in the summer so that during the winter, the Himalaya, central and eastern Himalaya, get their moisture in the summer, that during the winter, there's still flow from the glaciers to fill the hydroelectric dams that are now being built in many places. And in some places, in the winter, the dams are not being, there's not enough runoff from the glaciers because they're not collecting enough snow in the winter.
Next question.
Yeah, excuse me. My name is Carter Brooks, and I actually make an art of melting ice. And you just preempted my question, which was going to be about what happens when the buffer of water supply for a quarter of the population of the planet is no longer there. But let me instead turn to the question of witnessing. You mentioned bearing witness, and I wonder what else are we missing collectively by not really bearing witness generally to these particular glaciers melting or any ice in the Arctic as well? What spiritual as well as practical value is there to this bearing witness question?
Well, what is so brilliant about this exhibition, in addition to the photography and the messages, is the linkage of coal and ice, the linkage of the Industrial Revolution and the glaciers on the planet. And that, quite frankly, is a linkage that has been missing from our climate movement in the last 20 years or so. And it can be seen in the fact that we talk about Antarctica almost completely separate from the Arctic. And as we have said before, the glaciers in the third pole area have been almost missing from the global debate. But they are all ice. They are all glaciers. And one of the reasons why the glaciers in my country, which are the largest glaciers in Europe and have been studied for more than 50 years, are relevant for the third pole cooperation. And that was in a way what led me in the beginning into this issue. Is they are very similar in nature to the glaciers in the Himalayan third pole region, except they're easily accessible. They are thin, they are melting fast, they are linked to rivers and glacial lakes. And so therefore, to some extent, the glaciers in my country are an ideal living laboratory for all the countries in the Himalaya regions. Similarly, what's happening in Greenland is an illustration also what can happen to the more massive ice sheets in other parts of the world. So we need to bring all these three fundamental ice-covered areas of the globe, the North Pole, the South Pole, and the Third Pole, together in our awareness, in our knowledge, and in our public policy, political debate on the issue. And as I said before, especially in this country, with all due respect to the great United States, it's very difficult to talk about climate change in this country for reasons that all of you know. And I'm not talking about Donald Trump. I mean, I talked about this 10, 15 years ago in America, and it was difficult then. It was difficult then. So that is why I started talking about the ice to American audiences, and to mainly try to communicate, as this exhibition does, what's happening to the ice-covered areas of the world. And I will give you a concrete example of the impact this can have. I told you before I founded the Arctic Circle with the annual assembly in Iceland 5 years ago. So a few months before the Paris Climate Agreement, I invited President Hollande to come and give a keynote speech at that assembly. He said, okay, I will come, but you need to take me to a glacier before. I said, okay, I will arrange that PR stunt for you. So he came about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We took him on a helicopter to the fastest retreating glacier in my country. But instead of letting the helicopter land at the edge of the glacier, I let it land where the glacier was when I was born. And I let him walk for more than half an hour over the black sand and the rocks from the retreating glacier, with the whole entourage of the French delegation and the media following him. And as my good friend Christina Figueres said, when he came back to Paris, that climate ice retreating walk had more impact on his soul, on his heart, on his experience of what climate change was all about, than any memorandums or speeches and so on. And when we finally came to the glacial lake at the edge of the glacier, my wife picked up an ice cube from the melting lake and gave it to him, to let him feel the melting in his hands. And it's this kind of a personal experience we have to give to people in influential position almost everywhere. And I know we can't bring people up to the Himalayan glaciers on the Third Pole, but somehow we need to make the experience of what's happening to the ice-covered areas of our planet an integral part of how people experience climate change. And this exhibition is a dramatic way to do it.
It's most certainly an issue of hearts and minds and souls.
Sure.
I'm wondering, for the South and Asian audiences, what are some of the tactics or the types of messaging or communications have been effective in that context?
I have a very good one, and we got together with ICIMOD in Nepal, GlacierWorks, and with the support of the Asia Society, and we took over a very big building, and we had the largest photo exhibit ever held in Nepal. And it was a 3-story building, and we brought through 6,000 students. And they had a curriculum, they had docents to guide them through, and they began to understand the concept, the basic concept of carbon molecules in the atmosphere and heat-trapping gases. And they were high school students and college students. And now some of those students, this was over 6 years ago, are joining our teams as glaciologists. So you just have to capture a young person's imagination. It's a photo exhibit. It's showing them what's happening to their country, and then give them information and give them a way to process that information and know what it means and resonate. And so, you know, I place my bet on the youth. You know, you give them the reins and the information, and and they will run with it.
I would say that, I mean, unlike this country, in India, from everything that I've seen and even heard from the people at the center, there is no skepticism about climate change. Really, there isn't any. There's no problem at all convincing people that this is something that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, it's not a matter of
complacency.
It's not a matter of believing it or not. Do you understand it?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of acting. It's not a matter of belief.
Absolutely. So I think we have time for maybe one, max 2 questions. I don't know.
Hi, my question is for Ólafur. I understand that there has been a recent explosion in tourism in Iceland. And I really love the story that you just shared. And I hope that people who visit Iceland from around the globe can be up close and personal with the experience, and hopefully that will shift mindset. But what do you say to someone who sees it as exploitation of climate change?
Well, thank you for this PR contribution to the tourism in my country. It's actually a very interesting phenomenon, because the bulk of the people who are coming to Iceland in recent years, and we have had an annual increase of 20 to 30% in tourism, are young people. Educated young people from Asia, from the United States, and from Europe. And they come, of course, for a number of reasons, for the extraordinary landscape and so on, but also because they are aware of what's happening to the climate. They come from polluted cities in Asia and elsewhere. And when we brought President Hollande there, he was also struck by the fact how many tourists were there looking at this retreating glacier. And Iceland, to some extent, is a very interesting example because, as many of you might know, we have moved away from coal and oil. When I was a young man growing up in Iceland, over 80% of our energy came from imported oil and coal. Now we have 100% clean energy in all electricity production and house heating. And it proves it can be done, and Iceland is not alone. Many people are not aware. If you take this triangle of countries in the northern part of the North Atlantic, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Faroe Islands, and Scotland, all these countries have in common that their electricity production now is between 60 to 100% based on clean energy. And they have all approached it from a different direction. But Iceland is also home to the fastest retreating glaciers in the Western world. So you can observe in one visit both the impact of climate change and the solution. And we have not talked about it here tonight, but let's not forget that the reason why the glaciers are melting in the third pole is the energy production based on fossil fuel, not only in Asia, but in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere. We are all responsible for what's happening to the glaciers in the Himalayas, not just China and India. So we need to talk about the combination between glaciers melting and the clean energy transformation that needs to take place. And although tourism growth in my country has some problems associated with it and challenges, to me personally, it is inspiring to see young people traveling from Asia, United States, and elsewhere coming to my country to witness firsthand what a pollution-free, 100% clean energy country actually looks like. And I can tell you a personal story again to illustrate it. My wife and I, a few years ago in February, took friends of ours to the famous tourist site of the glacier and the Golden Waterfall. And it was, I have to admit to you, I've never been there in February myself. We don't go in February if we are an Icelander. But it was full of young people, mainly from Asia. And as we had lunch in the location, there was a group of young women in their 30s sitting at the table next to us, and my wife stood up and wanted to find out, as we were talking about it, what are these women doing here? It turned out they all worked on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And they had come to Iceland to witness the glaciers and the clean energy transformation. And if young professional women on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange want to come to Iceland to witness a responsible future of the world, I think it's a good signal that my country is proud to serve as a facilitator for change in the perception of these young people in their home country.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you to our distinguished panel for your insights, for the stimulating conversation. I hope that in the margins of this exhibit we can continue the discussion. I'd like to thank the Coal and Ice exhibit organizers and the Emerson Collective for organizing this panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great.
It's great, thank you.